I'm Carolyn from the Academy of Science. We're very pleased to be partners with the St. Louis Zoo to bring you conservation conversations, generously underwritten by Cooper Busman. Many of you are Academy members and friends. For those of you who are not familiar with the Academy, I'd like to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about who we are. The Academy is an independent science organization supported entirely through community contributions. We have been connecting science in the community since 1856 and have a long-standing mission to advance the public understanding of science and inspire the next generation of scientists and science advocates. We offer a broad range of free and low-cost public science programming, collaborative seminar series, and trips and tours highlighting science venues throughout the region. You can find more information on the Academy and our community-wide events by visiting the website academyofsciencestl.org. You may also visit us on Facebook or Twitter or pick up some of our literature that is on the table in the lobby. If you'd like to receive e-notification of upcoming Academy and St. Louis Zoo public lectures and events, there's an e-news sign-up sheet also on the table at the back of in the lobby, and some that will make their way around the audience this evening. If you are a student who needs to verify your attendance, please come see me after the talk. We also have some upcoming events posted, as you probably have read a few of them as you've been sitting here. So if you have any questions about these events after the lecture, you can come find me. I usually hang out right up here. And with that, I'm going to introduce Eric from the zoo.
Well, welcome. I'm Eric Miller from the zoo. I'm the Senior Vice President for Zoological Operations. And tonight, more importantly, I'm the Director of the Wild Care Institute. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Macek, who will be our speaker. There's so much to say, I'm going to look at the notes here so I don't miss anything. Michael has been in the zoo business for 28 years and worked at 3 zoos, Brookfield, Hillsville, and fortunately for us, the last 23 years at St. Louis. He's the curator of birds, responsible for the management of that entire set of facilities, collections, and staff. In addition, he was the founder of the Center for Conservation of the Humboldt Penguin in Punta San Juan, Peru, which you'll hear about tonight, and the Center for Conservation of the Horned Guan in Mexico. Since 1996, he's been actively involved also in the conservation of the endemic avifauna of the Northern Mariana Islands, and we have been picked by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to be one of the breeding centers for those animals for ex situ breeding. Mike also participates in various programs of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the North American kind of grandfather organization for all zoos. He is currently the chair of the AZA Picaformes Taxon Advisory Group and the SSP coordinator and stud bookkeeper for Crested Screamers. So with that, please welcome Michael.
Thank you. Can anybody hear me? Are we on? Yeah? Is this working? Okay, hi, thank you. Thanks for coming tonight. As Eric said, my name is Mike Macek. I'm curator of birds, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of our conservation programs in Punta San Juan, Peru. Let's get to the first slide here. So before I get started talking about the wild care, about this particular project within the Wild Care Institute, is everybody aware of what the Wild Care Institute is? You know, just a few hands, not too many. So all of you may or may not know that the zoo, and like many zoos around North America, we do a lot of conservation work, both within the zoo, within our communities, and farther afield. And the Wild Care Institute in 2004 was established as sort of the conservation arm of the St. Louis Zoo, but for many, many years, and probably since the beginning of the St. Louis Zoo in 1910, we were involved in conservation. But the Wild Care Institute was a little bit more formalized in 2004. And what we did there was basically try to focus some of the conservation initiatives that we were doing. So all of us at the zoo were doing lots of different things in lots of different places. And we were having some impact, but we probably weren't having the greatest impact we could. So the idea was to sort of focus and have a greater impact. So today we actually have 12 wild care centers within the world, the globe. 4 of those centers are right here in Missouri, and then the others are farther afield. And everything, we're working with everything from little invertebrates, burying beetles right here in Missouri, to Grevy zebras in Africa and birds in the South Pacific. But again, it's a little bit more focused. Within the bird department, we actually have 3 projects. 2 are sort of official wild care centers. One is sort of a lesser center, but still very important. The 2 centers we work with are horned guan, which is a critically endangered species that's found in just 2 very small isolated populations in Mexico and in Guatemala. We also work with, as Eric had mentioned, a variety of endemic species of birds that are found on the small Pacific, South Pacific island chain of the Northern Marianas Islands. And there was a tree snake that was introduced to those islands, and these birds that evolved on those islands evolved in the absence of a predator. So something like a tree snake can have an incredible impact and has had an incredible impact on those birds. So we're working there as well. But tonight we're going to talk about the Humboldt penguin in Punta San Juan, Peru. And I will say, too, that even though the Wild Care Institute was established in 2004, we've actually been working with Humboldt penguins here at the zoo as early as the 1976, I believe. And my first trip to Punta San Juan was actually in 2001. So even before the Wild Care Institute was established, we already had some connections to this place. So the first thing I'd like to do is sort of tell you where we are. Americans are notoriously bad on geography. But this is South America, so North America is right up there. That's Peru, just underneath Ecuador and Quito. And we are working, so here's Peru. So Lima is, I don't have a pointer. Do I have a pointer? Maybe not. Here's a pointer. So Lima is right here. And we're working close to Nazca in Punta San Juan, which is near the town of Marcona. So that's about a 7-hour drive south of Lima. So we normally fly into Lima and then generally take the Pan American Highway south to Punta San Juan. And so we're actually closer to the Chilean border than anything. And this is desert coast. So this is dry desert coast. I'll show you some pictures in a moment. But that's one thing that I think kind of surprises people, that penguins are actually found in the desert. Does everybody know that penguins are only found in South America, south of the not in South America, but south of the equator, southern hemisphere? Okay, most people are, so I'm glad about that. But believe it or not, they're found as far north as the Galapagos Islands. There's a Galapagos penguin, which is right on the equator. And these areas are very arid and dry because you have the Andes running right through sort of the middle of the country. So this is all Amazonian jungle on this side, and the coast is dry desert. And this is Punta San Juan, so this is where we work. So it's actually a peninsula, and our field station, or our field house, is way down here. So this little mark right here is the field house, and that line that you see is actually a wall. That's a wall that's about 1.2 miles that protects the peninsula. I'm going to get into the reason why it's protected in just a moment. But this is, you can see how arid it is. That's pretty much how it looks. It's like a lunar landscape. And really, it's not until you actually get to the coast that you see the incredible diversity of life that exists really along the coastal areas. And it's because of the water, the Humboldt current, again, that I'll talk to you about a little bit more in a moment, that brings all that rich biodiversity to the area. Not that there aren't animals in the desert. There are incredible animals in the desert as well, but really the diversity lies along the coast. So why is this place so important? So when we decided that we wanted to work with Humboldt penguins, and as I said, the impetus for working with Humboldt penguins was, one, the creation of the Wild Care Institute. We had a new director at the time, Jeffrey Bonner, that came on board. He wanted us to sort of focus our interests. As I mentioned, I had already been working in Punta San Juan as early as 2001. We were opening a penguin exhibit, so it was sort of like a gimme. You got to do something with penguins, right? So we decided to work with Humboldt penguins. And the question was, so why Punta San Juan? What's the focus of Punta San Juan? Because, of course, they do range anywhere from northern Peru all the way down to about the middle of Chile. But there's something very important about Punta San Juan itself. And those items are right there. There's a the continental shelf, actually, that you see this line here, comes very, very close to Punta San Juan. And you can see how far it is there compared to Punta San Juan. There's also intense winds that go north which creates an upwelling. So what happens is it draws the water from the lower depths up to the surface. And so the water at the surface near Punta San Juan is about 3.5 to 5.5 degrees cooler than anywhere else along the coast. So these are really favorable for cold adapted wildlife, particularly because cold water tends to support a lot more oxygen than warm tropical, even though many of you have probably dived or gone scuba diving in tropical waters, and it's very beautiful, coral reefs, et cetera. But believe it or not, the colder water actually will support more animals. So, and the penguins know that, and it's not just the penguins, but the boobies and the pelicans and the fur seals and the Inca terns, and all those animals know that. So this is a very good place to live, because you don't have to go very far to go hunting and get plenty of food. Again, that you don't have to swim very far out because of the closeness of the continental shelf. And this sort of kind of shows that a little bit better. So you could see there's the continental shelf, and there's also the Nazca Trench, which is a very deep, so that's the shelf sort of further up there. And then you have the Nazca Trench that runs along the western coast of Peru. You have that upwelling, as I mentioned, and you get there's enough clarity in the water that in those shallower waters, you're going to get cold water, but enough clarity to provide a lot of phytoplankton and phytoplankton, et cetera. And the winds come along the coast, creating that upwelling. Now down here, you'll see, so Punta San Juan is right about here. So the most fertile water temperatures are actually these light pink areas. So these darker pink areas are sort of the tropical areas. That's where you all might have been scuba diving or snorkeling. But these are the really rich waters. This is where a lot of commercial fishing is happening. But look what happens right here. Look how it peaks up here. And that's right where Punta San Juan here is. So that's one of the northernmost points in Peru where that cold water can be found. And so that's why the animals basically chose that place. And that's why it's so important to the species, because that's where one of the largest Peruvian breeding populations occurs. They have a world population of only about 60,000 animals, and there are actually more that live in Chile than in Peru, about 20,000 in Peru. And of those, about close to 50% of the breeding population occurs in just this one point. So if you can conserve Punta San Juan, you have a pretty good chance of conserving the species, at least in Peru. And here's, obviously the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton will support fish, the fish, and the main food source of the Humboldt penguin, by the way, is Anchovetta. It's a sort of anchovy, very similar to the sort of anchovies you might have on your salad. And that's the main food source. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, because that's one of the major threats facing the Humboldt penguin, that there is such a large amount of this Anchovetta being farmed by or harvested by commercial fisheries. It's actually competing directly with the penguins for a food source. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So again, you have these dry desert coasts. You have these incredible fertile, cold current, the Humboldt current coming up along the coast. And as a result, you see this incredible diversity. And as you're driving down there, we just had a keeper come back the day before yesterday. Today was actually her first day at work, Cindy Gitter. She's sitting right there. And she was participating in our health assessment. And that's everybody's first comment as you're driving down for 7 hours through this, lunar landscape. It's just nothing, nothing, nothing. You get to the coast and this is what you see. Just animals everywhere, and hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of them when it comes to, for example, the Guano cormorant, this bird right here. Literally, absolutely everywhere. Some of the largest colonies of South American fur seals that you see here and sea lions are found in this location. And this is a distinct species from the sea lion that's found like in California, for example. And actually a distinct species of pelican as well. So let me tell you a little bit about the Humboldt penguin. So the Humboldt penguin occurs there as well. This is the Humboldt penguin, kind of your standard penguin, right? Black and white, stands about this tall, not the smallest, not the biggest, just kind of medium size. But I want to tell you a little bit about the biology of the Humboldt penguin, because it'll make a little more sense when we're talking later about the conservation challenges that the species exhibits. The most important thing probably, or challenge for the Humboldt penguin, is that in In the wild, it's a relatively long-lived bird. I would say the average life is probably approximately 15, 16 years old. In captivity, we have animals that can live to be in their 30s, but that wouldn't be typical in the wild. But they can take 4 or 5, well, I'd say 3 to 4 years maybe to become sexually mature. When they do, they may only nest once or twice a year, depending on the conditions. When they do nest, they only lay 1 or 2 eggs. So you can see their reproductive potential is relatively low. If you have a couple bad years, they may raise no babies at all. Even a good year, even though they might be able to nest 2 times a year, 2 eggs per nest, even if all 4 chicks were to hatch, maybe only 1 would survive on that particular year. They do generally mate for the season. So they're monogamous for that particular season. So there was a thought for a while that penguins were very monogamous. And if any of you saw the March of the Penguins, they kind of focused on the emperor penguin. That penguin is relatively monogamous for its lifetime, even though they don't spend their entire lives together. The females go out on the ocean, the males go out to the ocean. They come back to reproduce, and they will often find one another, but they don't always find one another. And now that we have genetics tools that we can look at, DNA mapping and things like that, we know that they're not as monogamous as we think they are. There's a lot of sort of philandering going around, and even a male and female may be pair bonded, and you may find out that their chick is not, in fact, belongs to him, it belongs to somebody else down the road. So they're not as monogamous, but they do pair bond for at least the breeding season. They also generally nest in burrows. But they can have open-faced nests as well, and they can nest in crevices. But the burrows are the most successful, for obvious reason. This would be a typical burrow. You have a top on it, there's protection, etc. A crevice or an open-faced, surface nest would be vulnerable to predators, things like turkey vultures and gulls. Probably would be the 2 largest predators, potentially rats and maybe some desert fox. So those sorts of burrows are probably the most successful. And they actually dig into them with their back feet. They'll dig in, and you'll see a burrow with, soil coming out, and it's not really soil. So let me tell you about that. It's actually guano. So this coastal area is just rock. I mean, it's just rock. So there's nothing that the birds can necessarily burrow into. What they're burrowing into is guano. And guano is poop, okay? It's bird poop. It sounds really, really gross, but it is kind of, but not as gross as you might think, because this is the desert, right? So first of all, the guano accumulates over years and years and years. It could be around the turn of the century before it was harvested, and I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. Before it was harvested really heavily, it could be 15, 20, 30 feet deep. This provided a substrate for the birds to burrow into. So it's so dry there that it actually is like soil or clay. When you're walking on it, because you're walking on it all the time, it feels like soil or clay. It doesn't. Now it has a very strong ammonia base to it. There's a lot of nitrogen in there. So when you smell the reserve before you get there, no doubt. So anyway, what that bird is burrowing into is actually guano, and that provides a safe place for the birds to burrow into, a safe nesting site. And we're going to talk more about that, why that's a challenge to the birds as well. So I think that gives you, and then also with regards to the birds becoming mature, a chick can take, maybe 3, 4 months, maybe about 2 months actually, 2, 3 months to fledge, and then they go off to the sea and they're on their own. Penguins, for the most part, are only driven to the land to reproduce. They'll spend the rest of their lives out in the open ocean. Humboldt penguins are a little bit different because they never really go too far, but they probably spend a majority of their life out in the open. It's only nesting and molting that drives them back to land. And molting is when they lose their feathers. All penguins, all birds, lose their feathers at least once a year and then grow new feathers. Obviously, if you're a penguin and you live in the ocean, you're going to have to come on the land to do that. So that's the only other time that they'll actually kind of come out of the water and spend a period of time on land when they molt. And penguins will drop all their feathers at once. And then they won't eat, they won't do anything during that period of time. They just sit on the beach looking very uncomfortable. They grow their feathers back maybe 10 days, 2 weeks, and then they can go back out fishing again. So that tells you a little bit about the biology of the species. So let's talk a little bit specifically about guano. and why that is a challenge. I'm going to talk about some of the other threats, but this is sort of a unique threat for this species of penguin. So guano has been exploited in Peru probably since the Inca times. It's a nitrogen-based commodity, so to speak, that is a good sort of fertilizer. So in fact, it was utilized quite a bit by the Peruvians up until about the turn of the century. And they were exporting so much of it as fertilizer, primarily to the United States and to Europe, that they didn't even have to pay any taxes. I mean, their roads were free, their schooling was free, et cetera. And there were huge accumulations of guano. Around the turn of the century, some of the largest of those deposits were exploited, but also around the First World War, there were a lot of artificial fertilizers that were produced. So the market with regards to the exporting of this commodity basically dropped out of the bottom. So they really couldn't and weren't really harvesting guano as a major export any longer. But during those harvests, you can imagine, there was no interest in the guano birds, there was no interest in the sea lions, the fur seals, the Humboldt penguins. They just wanted to harvest the guano. So lots of animals were killed during that process. The guaneros, as they're called, the people who actually harvest the guano, they're called guaneros, they would come to the coast and they'd even eat the penguins and the pelicans and the sea lions. While they're there, they could be down there for months harvesting the guano. They would eat the birds. And then, of course, they were also removing the nesting habitat. So then once all the guano was removed, there was no place for them to nest. So, but back then, the focus was on the guano. There was no focus on the birds or the animals that lived there. So the guano is actually produced primarily by these three species. So the Humboldt penguin itself is not really a guano. Now, they produce guano, obviously. We all produce guano. But they're not one of the major producers of the guano that is being harvested. And that's because they're not in the large numbers. These are the three species, the Peruvian or Nazca booby, the Guano cormorant, and it's primarily the cormorant, and the brown South American pelican. These are the birds that are in huge numbers, as I mentioned, hundreds of thousands. In the case of the Guano cormorants, probably millions that come to these locations, the same locations as the penguins, to nest. And these are all actually Guano cormorant nests. So when you come onto the reserve, you see this lunar landscape which looks like it's just dotted with a bazillion crater holes. But they're not. They're actually used up nests that were built by primarily the Guano cormorants. And all of this is guano. So what the birds do is as they're sitting on the egg, they just kind of scoot around to go to the bathroom. And they just keep scooting around. So they create these rings of guano, essentially. And these just build up over years and years and years. So around the turn of the century, this is what Punta San Juan looked like. So these are all Guano cormorants. These are not penguins. These are Guano cormorants. And at that time, the government of Peru actually established a sort of guano administration or a guano company within the government. So even though it wasn't a major export any longer, they were still interested in utilizing it domestically. And so there was some effort to kind of manage the areas where the guano was being harvested. And Punta San Juan isn't the only place. There's actually 33 locations along the coast. There were probably more prior, but 33 identified locations now along the coast of Peru that are being managed by the sort of guano administration sort of company of the Peruvian government. But this was first established around the turn of the century. This kind of shows you the different locations. Again, there's 33, and these are islands or islets or peninsulas, sort of, along the coast. And that's guano. So look at all of that guano. That's actually, it looks like that's like a cow or a horse or something, a mule or something. So that's a lot of guano. And that picture was probably taken around the turn of the century. And there's a variety of endangered species that live within the guano system, these areas that are being sort of semi-protected. The one thing about, and this is where the wall came in, by the way, the Guano administration put up that wall to protect Punta San Juan, the peninsula, for basically protecting the guano birds. They weren't interested even then in the Humboldt penguins, but they wanted to protect the guano birds because the guano birds were producing the guano and they wanted to harvest it. But when they built that wall, they were inadvertently actually protecting a lot of other species that didn't produce guano but were benefiting from the level of protection that they were providing to these areas. And this is in Spanish, but there's things like fur seals, marine otters are critically endangered. The birds are the brown pelican, the Humboldt penguin. Vulnerable species include the South American sea lion, Inca terns, and guano cormorants, a variety of boobies and things like that. So lots of other animals are benefiting from this level of protection. The one thing to keep in mind is that the Guano administration, remember, their main focus is the guano. They're not really focused or interested in protecting the birds, so to speak, other than the guano cormorants that produce a majority of the guano. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So again, lots of animals and birds benefit from this level of semi-protection. These are basically pelicans nesting on the bottom of the screen. The middle, the white area is all Nazca or Peruvian boobies. And then the top area, it would be all guano cormorants. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands, again, maybe millions of animals nesting in these locations. So around the early 1900s, 1909 was when the administration was developed. This shows you the number in millions of the guano birds, particularly the guano cormorants again. So you could see that there were like 5 million around the turn of the century. When the Guano administration was developed and some protection started to occur in the middle 1900s, or 1909, 1910, you could see the numbers started to climb. And then around the late 1930s, they started to develop walls for some of the peninsula, at least. The islands are kind of protected anyway, but the peninsulas, they started to put up walls. And you could see the numbers really shot up. And those walls are protecting from a variety of things, which I'll talk about in a moment. But so those walls really did help a lot of the animals and really did help the guano cormorants rebound and probably numerous other species that live in those areas. Nevertheless, harvesting still occurs, and I'm going to talk about right now what we're doing with regards to the harvest. One of the things we're doing within the Penguin Center. So the first sustainable guano harvest was my first participation in Punta San Juan, and this is in 2001. So that's 11 years ago, and I didn't even have hair back then. This was the first time that the commodity of guano was going to be, or we attempted to harvest it sustainably. So prior to 2001, they were just going in there, getting what they needed, and getting out. So we decided with our partners at the time, which was actually the American Zoo and Aquarium Association Species Survival Plan, which is sort of a management team for Humboldt penguins within AZA or North American Zoo organizations. They kind of got together, and along with our colleagues in Punta San Juan, particularly the Heredia University in Lima, and one particular woman who kind of was the main impetus for developing partnerships with U.S. zoos, Patricia Maloof, who still works there today, to kind of come together and create the first sustainable harvest. The idea was that if Americans came, it would bring a level of importance. So our role was to go there as international observers to the harvest. And so when we got there, we basically met with the harvesters, the guaneros, Americans and Peruvians. So there were, as many Peruvians as there were Americans, probably 50 of each. The harvest takes about 3 months, so we all came for like 2-week, 3-week periods, worked with our Peruvian counterparts, but basically met with the guaneros, told them why we were doing it. They all signed a little contract saying that they would do this in a sustainable manner. And the most important thing that we actually did was delineate areas beyond which they could not harvest. So basically making lines and saying, you can't take anything beyond this point. And obviously one side of that that line was where the animals lived. The other side was sort of that high plain where there really wasn't any animal activity going on at the time. And at the end of that, they were wonderful about it. At the end of it, they all got a little diploma saying that they took part in the first sustainable harvest, and everything was good. I mean, it was really a good, positive experience for, at that time, we were working with just the Guano administration, the American zoos. The student, or the Peruvians that were involved were primarily students from the university I mentioned in Lima, and Patricia Maluf, which was our main contact at the time. And so you could see, basically, we just delineated the area. Everything to the left on this side was being harvested. To the right, which was more coastal area over here, was where the animals were living. And it's all bagged up. It's all done manually. There's no, with the exception of trucks that sort of cart it away, it's all picked and mined manually with pickaxes and shovels, put into 50-pound bags, and then just walked into trucks and marketed away. And in 2007, we actually did it again. And this is Rick Smith, one of our other keepers that participated in that. And you could see everything is absolutely, it's just done by hand. And the second time was really important because there was better documentation of what was going on. Because our hope is that ultimately these protocols will be utilized in all those other sites we talked about. There were 33 sites, remember, this is just one. So we'd really like it if the government will eventually utilize these protocols in those other sites, doing it in a sustainable manner where Peruvians can get the commodity that they would like and at the same time not really harm their wildlife. So it benefits everybody. 2012, we did another one this year. And this year was truly international because, I mean, it was international before, but it's even more international because now we had Europeans involved. So we had Peruvian students once again. We had a number of American Zoo and Aquarium Association participants, including people from the St. Louis Zoo. We also had Europeans from the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums. So that was really exciting to get them involved as well. There were a couple new things that were done this year, and that was instead of just using the kind of posts with the flags on it, we actually used this sort of burlap screen, and it actually worked quite well. And that's because this year the harvest took place a little bit later than we would normally do it. Normally we'd try to do the harvest when the penguins weren't breeding. This year, for a variety of reasons, we had to do it when the penguins were breeding. And so these are penguins basically breeding on this side, and they actually did very, very well with it. They didn't seem to be troubled by that at all. And again, you could see, so these are the observers. You spend a lot of your day doing that. So for those of you interested in field work, just so you know, there's great, wonderful things about it, but there's also some downtime. This isn't necessarily downtime, but the observers, they're just that. They're international observers. So they spend a lot of time watching the guaneros working in shifts. There's other things they do as well, but this is probably one of the most important things they do. You can see the harvesting going on down there, the penguins in the back, and they also use signs this year to basically tell the guaneros. Again, you could have 300 to 500 guaneros there. So you want to make sure they don't go where they're not supposed to go. That's a lot of people to keep track of. And you want to make sure that the animals are protected and not being disturbed. So those signs were something new this year, as was the barricade there. And again, this is some of the group in 2012. Kim Washington from the Bird Department participated this year. There's also lots of talks that take place. So up here in the field station, we're talking to both the Peruvians and the Americans and the Europeans about why it's so important. You basically meet every single day, who's going to do what that day, staff work in shifts, and then everybody was working for about 2.5 week shifts, and we covered about a 3-month period. The harvest is done now, but there still is a lot of the guano that has to be processed, but it's been moved away from where the animals are, so it doesn't need the same level of sort of oversight as it did when it was first being harvested. The other thing we did this year that was interesting is we have a student that's working with the Whitney Harris Foundation and the St. Louis Zoo. He is a master's fellow, and this is a partnership between UMSL and the Whitney Harris Foundation and the zoo to basically support a master's or doctorate level student to train at the University of Missouri and have the idea is that it be incorporated with some project that's going on at the St. Louis Zoo. And we were fortunate enough to actually recruit for, and this is the first time we've done this, Alonso Busayu from Peru. And Alonso just happened to be graduating 2 years ago when we were starting this fellowship. And he'd helped us while he was an undergrad doing a variety of things that we do in Punta San Juan. So he's been spending the last 2 years at UMSL getting his master's in ecology. And he wanted to look at, and this is his master's thesis, to look at a couple of things. But one was the success level of the birds using the different kinds of nesting habitats. So one, using artificial nests, using the natural burrows that are actually dug into the guano, the surface nests, which this bird has no protection at all, he's just nesting on the surface, and a crevice, which is just kind of like in the crevice of a rock. So he was looking at the success rate of those different kinds of nesting types, but also looking at the impact of the harvest during a breeding season. So he was collecting data all through that period. He spent all of last summer through the end of August in the field. He's back here now wrapping up his school work and will be writing his thesis next year. So this will be incorporated in that management plan as well. And we have some good reasons to believe that these protocols will in fact be incorporated in the harvests in the other areas. I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. I'm going to check my time here just to see where we are. Okay, yeah, we're good still. Anyway, so let me tell you a little bit about some of the other threats. I wanted to get the harvest part out of the way because it's sort of unique, and it is a threat, but not as much of a threat as it used to be. Because at least in Punta San Juan, we've done 3 harvests now that have been very sustainable. And I will say, those were the only 3 that have been done since 2001. The guano isn't harvested every year. It's supposed to be harvested every 10 years, but that doesn't necessarily happen, obviously. It was done in 2001, 2007, 2012. But since 2001, it's been done in a sustainable manner. Other threats, though, do include predators, and these are some of the, at least the top, these top 3 on that corner would be predators that wouldn't be natural predators. And these are things that the wall does help. The Peruvian fox is a native animal, but there's also lots of feral dogs because there is a town nearby called Marcona. This keeps those animals from coming onto the reserve and disturbing any of the wildlife there. The rat is not a native rat, it's brought in, but the more we can keep people and trucks and supply trucks and things out of the reserve, the less likely we are to have a problem. It does help keep people out. And the biggest impact, well, one of the impacts that they probably have is shell fishing, and they'll come into the shallows to collect shellfish and things like that. But the problem is that that's where the birds are. The birds are in sort of the shallow water right along the coast. So that has a great impact, again, on not just the fur seals and sea lions, but the penguins and pelicans and everything that lives there. Obviously, these are natural predators, so we're not so worried about them because that's just nature's way. But that I think the greatest benefit that the wall has is keeping feral animals out and probably people. So we've taken a lot of effort in maintaining that wall. Like I said, it's about a 1.2-mile wall, and you could see it there in the background on the other side. And as it's so close to the coast, you can imagine there's a lot of destruction that happens because of the salty air, and it's constantly windy there. So a lot of money has gone into supporting this. We had an Adopt a Wall program for a while where different zoos could adopt sections of the wall to get them rebuilt. That was very successful. I think the wall is relatively in good shape at the moment, but no doubt we'll have to attend to it again. Even though this wall is owned by the Guano administration of Peru, you could see by its condition up there, they're not putting too much money into it. So a lot of our partners in the way of zoos and very generous donors, et cetera, have helped to kind of maintain that wall. I think one of the most important things we've done with 2 of our partners, the Philadelphia Zoo and the Chicago Zoological Society, or the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago, is actually have hire permanent staff to be present on the site at all times. So this is a relatively remote area, and you're living in Guano. So you can imagine it's kind of hard to recruit people to live there, and particularly young people, have the rest of their lives in front of them. But we've been really fortunate through the years, and I guess we've maintained staff there for probably longer than the Wild Care Institute, probably closer to like maybe 10 or 11 years we've managed to maintain staff there. And we provide the salary along with our 3 partners, equal parts, that will actually support 3 staff to be there at all times. The staff is a little different right now. It has changed through the years. Right now, the gentleman on the left, Marco Cardena, he's still there. The other 2 have gone, but we've replaced them with other really good staff. And they do lots of things. They support the projects that we are working on. They obviously oversee the place. They work with the community. As I said, they assist in our programs, and Marco even has some independent programs that he works on. But that's really important. If you have a physical presence, that is so important. Imagine if we just had the wall, but there was nobody there. Knowing that there are people there, they know the people in the community, that's really, really important. In fact, Marco even works very closely with the local port authority, where a lot of artisanal fisheries are. He knows all of the fishermen. He has the numbers of all of their boats in case they get too close to the reserve, and he'll report them to the authorities. And of course, you have to be a little bit diplomatic and political about it, because these are also his neighbors and friends. But it's had a great benefit to have staff there all the time. As I said, there's Marco. They do a lot of the upkeep. These are blinds that we have throughout the reserve to observe the various animals. They do a lot of upkeep of the reserve and the sort of infrastructure of the place. As I said, he does keep track of artisanal fisheries, and we have 2 issues when it comes to fisheries: the big commercial fisheries and the artisanal fisheries. So the artisanal fisheries are sort of, again, as I said, the local people that just go out to get food for the day, or maybe sell a few things in the market. And you're talking about really small-scale boats like this. They're not going very far out. They're going just along the coast, throwing nets, and again, this is where the birds are, in the more shallow water. And what's happening there, as you can imagine, is bycatch, or unintentional netting of the animals. And so we do actually go to the port. Marco tries to keep track of the number of animals that are being, accidentally caught in nets. Tries to tell them they should stay away from the reserve. They are supposed to stay a mile off the coast, but unfortunately, they don't always follow those rules. In some cases, the local people are still actually eating the penguins for fiestas, so it's sort of considered a delicacy. I can't imagine. It's probably very greasy. Anything that eats fish isn't usually like the best, but it's considered a bit of a delicacy. So there's a lot of community outreach and public education into why that's probably not the best thing to do. And I think we've had some impact, but probably not completely. And as I already mentioned, there is a lot of still shell fishing that occurs along the coast. And up until about last year, there was a new technique where people were actually throwing dynamite into the water. I guess it was kind of easy. You would just throw some dynamite in the shallows. It would kill everything in there that would then float up to the top. Of course, it would kill penguins and sea lions and anything that was in that immediate area. They're not really doing that anymore, so that's good. But there were 3 or 4 years that was a bit of a problem. So the other issue is actually these big industrial fisheries. And this isn't actually Peruvians. These are primarily foreign investors that are working here. They're working much further out, but and in this case, they're not necessarily bycatching the penguins, but they're directly competing with the bird's major food source, which is the anchovy, or that Anchovetta fish I told you about. If you look at this chart, you probably can't read this, but these are basically the metric tons of Anchovetta that are being harvested. China is the worst with regards to harvesting the Anchovetta. Peru is the second. So actually, what do we have here? So Peru alone catches more than 160 other countries with regards to the Anchovetta. And when I say Peru, I should say that's in Peru. Peru isn't, it's not Peruvian companies that are harvesting here, it's foreign companies, but there's not a lot of oversight or regulation with regards to their fisheries, so they're just harvesting as much as they want. And this is directly affecting the penguins, because this is what they eat, this is their main food source. So what do you do about something like that? Well, I think what you have to try to do is make anchovies important to Peruvians. If they feel they have an interest in that commodity, they're not going to let foreign companies come in and take all that they want. To date, anchovy is primarily just, it's not eaten. This isn't the stuff that you guys are probably putting on your Caesar salads. This is primarily being ground up into fish meal and then sent to, guess who, us and Europe, for food, animal feed. So it's put in for cows and pigs and stuff like that. So it's basically just ground up into fish meal. So again, the Peruvians don't benefit from this in any way at all. Foreign companies are harvesting it, then they send it out to Europeans. And it's also used, this is very ironic, it's also used as fish meal for salmon fishing, commercial salmon fishing. So again, primarily by the United States and Europe. So they feed the ground up anchovy to salmon, which are then harvested, and there's no, those salmon do not find their way back to Peru. There's no way they could afford them. We're eating them, and that's one reason why. Have any of you seen the safe fish cards that you can get? The Monterey Bay Aquarium puts them out, like what to eat and what not to eat. And I remember when those first came out, I saw when it said farmed salmon. I thought, well, that sounds good. I mean, they're not catching the wild salmon, they're catching the farm salmon. That sounds good to me. Well, this is why. Those farm salmon are actually eating all of this Anchovetta, and again, and there's byproducts associated with that too. There's pollutants that are going into. What they do is they just take a big net and they put it in the ocean, and they're literally, they raise the salmon in these big nets out in the ocean. They dump all this fish meal in there, and they grow them up to a certain size, and then they harvest them. But that's why the harvesting of the farm-raised salmon is not good. So how do you change that? You try to make the Anchovetta important to the Peruvians. It's never been, fish have been a big part of their cuisine, but anchovy never has. So again, with our partners at the university in Heredia, and now they actually have an organization, and this is all evolved since we've worked with them. They now have an organization called the Center for Sustainable Resources, and that's within the university. And they have been very active, and we've helped them in funding what started about 3 years ago as the Week of the Anchovetta. So what they've done is they've tried to incorporate Anchovetta into some of their sort of local cuisines, substituting them for some fish like sushi and ceviche and things like that they already had, but also incorporating just, new things. And they have a big market in Lima where they have big displays and everything, but they're also reaching out in a bigger way through television. And this is sort of their version of the Food Channel. And they've gotten some of the best chefs, basically, in Peru to utilize the anchovy on their TV shows, but also in some of the best restaurants in Lima. And they're in about their third year now. They even had a dinner at the president's, it's actually the Pink House, the Casa Rosa. And this is, I'm not sure if he's still president, but this was the president at the time. And they served anchovy to the president and had a big press release. And so the idea is to kind of change the value of the anchovy. Before the early 1900s, Peruvians didn't eat chicken. I mean, it just wasn't something they ate, and they were starving. And so the president at that time introduced chicken into their cuisine, and now it's one of the probably the largest proportion of protein that they eat is chicken. So it is doable. I mean, you can do it. You can change, you can change ideas about food and food sources. It just takes time. And they're in their third year right now, and again, we've supported that, and I think it's a great program, and that is also growing every single year. Another threat is obviously global warming. And the biggest issues with regards to the penguins is the warming of the water. So remember I said it was so important that some of the current, the Humboldt current was about 5 degrees cooler, anywhere from 3 to 5 degrees cooler. That doesn't seem like a lot, but that's really important. You raise that up just a little bit, what happens is the fish that love that cool, oxygen-rich water, they go out into the deeper water. And what happens is if the animals that don't necessarily forage that far out, they either have to go further out, expending more energy, or they simply starve. Whether you believe in global warming or not, the one thing we do know is that El Niños are happening much more frequently. So instead of happening every 50 years, they're happening every 10 years, every 12 years, maybe every 5 years, maybe not such big ones, but it's more frequent. And remember what I said about sort of the natural history of the penguin? They can take 3 or 4 years to become sexually mature. And in 1 year, they may only lay 2 eggs. And of those, maybe only 1 will survive. So if you get knocked back from an El Nino and birds die and they starve to death, it's going to take a long while for them to bounce back up to where they were before. And if you keep hitting them every 5 years with even maybe not a big El Nino, it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So that is a bigger idea to kind of get your head around. I mean, how do we affect this? That's obviously a global issue, but it is an issue nevertheless. And the best thing we can probably do is monitor it and report how it's affecting populations to the authorities. And that is in fact what we're doing. We do censuses every year. We have our staff in Punta San Juan that keep track of that sort of thing. The last big El Nino was in 1978, 1997, 1998, and you could see between 50 to 80% of the main seabird and mammal populations in Peru died. You could see the Humboldt penguins literally were halved. Fur seals and South American sea lions, just dramatic drops in numbers. And the Guano cormorants, same thing, incredible drops in numbers. And so numbers are now probably just getting to where they were before this major El Nino. As I mentioned, pollution is another threat, and this is mostly from those fish meal plants I was telling you about that are located right along the coast. This kind of shows you, again, we're down here. Punta San Juan is down here, and this just kind of shows you the areas, what it says is the areas of contamination, and right now the area of Punta San Juan is mildly contaminated, but there's potential for it to be worse. This is probably one of the next major threats is hydrocarbon exploration. These 2 maps basically show you between April of 2003 and June of 2003, the yellow area indicates where the exploration has occurred. And you could see it's dramatically different here. And again, we're probably down around here somewhere. So a lot of potential exploration happening in that area. This was in 2003. I don't have a map right now, but you can imagine what it probably looks like now. So you're seeing the Andes are in the middle with some desert, but really it's the Amazon and those coastal areas. They're 2 most bio-rich areas in Peru, potentially being exploited. Another potential problem is the expansion of the Pan American Highway. At the moment, it kind of, well, frankly, it kind of ends up there somewhere, but they're planning on bringing it to Nazca, and believe it or not, all the way down to San Juan, with a major shipping port potentially located right there. Now, that's on the horizon. I mean, they've been talking about that for a long time, and obviously something like that takes a lot of money. But that is a potential problem that could be in the future. So what do we do about something like that? All of those threats that we just talked about with regards to environment, really all we can do is education, outreach, and community outreach. Educate the people who live there. Believe it or not, the people that live on that other side of the wall, some of them may have never even seen a penguin. Certainly most of them have never actually been on the reserve because they're not allowed. That's starting to change now. That's a good thing. But we are working with, we have 2 components to our education programs. One is education outreach through an organization called ACOREMA. They're located actually a little bit further north of the coast. So they're about 2.5 hours from Punta San Juan. The reason we chose them, because they're located in a place called Paracas, and that's a major sort of weekend tourist area for people from Lima. So people from Lima come down to Paracas, and they have a little area called the Ballestas Islands, and it's sort of like the Galapagos of Peru. So there's lots of hotels, there's beaches, they take little boat trips out to these islands to see the penguins, but they have great potential for impact because there's a huge population from Lima that come there for the weekend. They may stay at hotels, they may have weekend houses, etc. So there's a great potential to reach a bigger audience, and an audience that might actually have a huge impact. The people in Lima, I mean, these are city folks. They don't spend a lot of time on the coast unless they're probably surfing, but you can really reach them. And ACOREMA focuses primarily in this area, Paracas. They have an education center that you can visit where they have a variety of, obviously, exhibits about sea lions, fur seals, penguins, and sea turtles. They actually started their program with sea turtles and dolphins. And we actually introduced the concept of working with penguins with them. So now they actually have a project that works with penguins. A variety of things you could see. They have penguin parades where they have, you know, like the weekend of the penguin, and they get school kids together. They have parades, and again, lots of outreach and curriculum that they developed. Here, ACOREMA is basically teaching the teachers. So they've developed curriculum around Humboldt penguins and the threats to the Humboldt penguin to develop curriculum within the grade schools to kind of reach those. Penguins are still often kept as pets, believe it or not, so there's some community outreach with regards to sort of repatriating those penguins back to the wild. I can't imagine the survivability of these individuals are really high, so it's good to get them back out there as soon as possible. Imagine living with a penguin in your kitchen. A new thing we're sort of doing and supporting is a project called Building Bridges with our partners in Chicago and at the Center for Resource Sustainability. This is Adrian Cerezo, and he's a very new, relatively new member of the St. Louis Zoo team. He's our Associate Director of Conservation Education Research. Did I get that right? I'm looking at Louise Bradshaw, that's right. Anyway, he's sort of a big picture guy. He's a big picture guy kind of looking at really how, and I'm getting my head around this too, but how some of these programs can affect a community in sort of long term. Like what happens when some of the children that these people are teaching, what happens when they grow up and they have children? Sort of these sort of big picture sort of, you know, philosophical changes in your mind and how you think about things. So he's a big picture kind of guy. This is actually a project that we have more local. This is actually in the community of Marcona, which is right next to San Juan. And again, these are the teachers that are teaching the grade school, in fact, and they're really looking at primary, I think, like maybe first or kindergarten and first grade, to talk to them about penguins and Punta San Juan and the coastal ecosystem, et cetera. And so there's plans to develop curriculum. There's plans to have specific activities, even on site, potentially, maybe bringing children on site, although it can be kind of a dangerous place, so we're kind of thinking about how we're going to do that. But really kind of getting them aware of what's happening on the other side of that wall, and then kind of tracking that over time and seeing how it really affects the community. Because they have to be part. I mean, these people, they're our neighbors. I mean, they're the success of Punta San Juan really sets on them. We're coming and going. They're there all the time. So this is new. This just started this year. We also do an annual census and have been for pretty consistently for the last 7 or 8 years. And censusing is really important for a lot of reasons. And we're doing a census of the entire Peruvian coast. So we're not just doing Punta San Juan. We're doing from north of Lima all the way south to the Chilean border. And this is important basically to track the effects of El Niños, things like that, to track dispersal of the animals, where they're moving, are populations staying in one place, or are they kind of moving up and down the coast? This seems to be true. You could find, you know, 1,000 birds in this one area one year, the next year they're 20 miles down in a sea cave further south. So we know that they are sort of moving around, and that's something we've learned. But we hope to one day have actually a meeting called a Population, Habitat, and Viability Assessment with our neighbors to the south, with the Chileans, to talk about what we can do about the whole population. And to do that, if you want to talk about how to save penguins in Chile and in Peru, you need to have some idea about what's going on with their population over a period of time. So hopefully in the next year or two, we'll have a meeting, and these census numbers will be very, very important because it'll determine trends that are occurring. And this is a pretty complicated, this looks really easy, but imagine if you're in a boat and you have a swell of like 8 feet and you're trying to count that. These aren't all penguins, by the way. These are penguins right here. These are all guano cormorants. So you have to be able to tell the difference between those two. when you're, I don't know, maybe 500 meters away from the coast on a boat that's going up and down. And this whole process will take probably about 12 weeks total. It takes about 6 weeks to get down the coast. Then we normally wait 2 weeks and then 2 weeks back up the coast. 6 weeks back up the coast. And this is done when the birds are molting. Remember I said one of the times they come onto shore is when they have to drop all their feathers. They normally do this all at the same time. So this is a pretty good time to try to count them. So we wait 2 weeks because there's always some that are kind of molting in the front and some molting at the end. So we wait 2 weeks, give them a little time, and then we start up the coast again and count again. And we've had a variety of staff that have helped us with that. We also do a health assessment, and I think we're in about our 6th year of a penguin health assessment. We've actually gotten samples and tagged over 1,000 birds, probably closer to 1,500 birds now of the Punta San Juan population. So another important thing when you're tracking population trends is to look at the health of the birds. What's changing over time? First of all, what's normal? What's sort of that baseline normal? And then what changes over time? So we're working with, again, this gentleman here, Dr. Michael Atkinson, used to be a veterinarian here at the St. Louis Zoo. That's when we started this project. Then he moved over to the Brookfield Zoo or the Chicago Zoological Society, which happened to be one of our partners already. I've mentioned them several times. So it works out really well. He's continuing to sort of spearhead this with our staff, and he still gets the support of both the St. Louis Zoo and the Chicago Zoological Society. But we're looking at those baseline things. We're looking at potential toxins. We're looking at potential diseases. Things like, with global warming, some diseases, things like avian malaria and West Nile disease, the ranges of those diseases can potentially spread. Some diseases are already starting to happen. Even human diseases are starting to spread. Things where we haven't seen, some diseases are now present in those areas because the climate's changing slightly. So we're tracking that over time. As I said, we're probably in like our 6th or 7th year now. As I said, we just had, this is Cindy, she's out in the audience on the right here. She just got back from the health assessment the day before yesterday. Melissa's also has been there. They don't just play with baby penguins, by the way. These were just the cute shots, but there's lots of serious science going on here. But in this picture here, you might not be able to see it, but that shiny thing right there is a band. We don't band the birds any longer on the flipper, but every single animal that is caught is identified, usually with the toe tag. And like I said, we have over probably about 1,500 of those 5,000 or so birds tagged already. Some of that bird was probably an older bird because I said we don't really use the bands on the wing anymore. And we've expanded this now to actually include pelicans and cormorants because remember, all these animals are living with the penguins, so they might have diseases that the penguins didn't used to get, but now they might. They might harbor new diseases that could potentially then flow into the penguin population. So we're looking at some of those animals as well. Not doing that as often, maybe every other year, collecting some samples on them. And it's also expanded into looking at the fur seals and the sea lions. And there's Cindy again with the fur seal pup, kind of monitoring them as well. And even marine invertebrates. So, and we're doing this primarily because these marine invertebrates tend to concentrate toxins and contaminants. So that's often, you've heard about shellfish, right? You have to be careful about shellfish. That's usually the first place that we become aware of a problem, because it's so concentrated in some of these marine invertebrates. So we have biologists that are working on that as well. Some really important news that we had at the end of 2009, and this was a very proud moment for us and our colleagues and our partners, is that these protected areas, these guano sites, were actually incorporated into a special area of protection, which included sort of their national park system. So they are now protected by the Guano administration, which its name has changed over the years, but it's called AgriReal now. But it's also covered now by their national park system. So it's kind of a dual management agency. And that's really important because remember, the Guano administration, they were primarily interested in the guano. The national park system, they're primarily interested in the ecology of the place, the animals, the plants, the the coast. So they have to work together. So the bottom line is there's a lot more permits, a lot more permission, and a lot more oversight that's going to go on on the part of the Guano administration by the National Park System. So that was a great stride. And that's why, and all 33 of those sites in the Guano system have been incorporated into the reserve system. That's why we're very encouraged that some of those protocols we've developed for harvesting the guano in a sustainable manner will be incorporated, because they're looking at what we're doing. They've got the microscope on us. They're looking at Punta San Juan to see what's going on there, because there's really, really very little going on the other sites. So they do want to try to incorporate that. While I was there this year, we had people from the National Park Service just kind of pop in on us because they wanted to see what we were doing and how we were doing it. So they're really interested. So we're really encouraged that they'll try to incorporate these things. Now that they have oversight, they have the first oversight, they have the second oversight. So they're going to want to manage these places in the most sustainable manner. Again, I think where are we in time-wise, but I'm kind of wrapping up here. I do want to thank everybody. I want to thank our main partners have been the Philadelphia Zoo and the Chicago Zoo, but there are numerous others, the Center for Sustainable Resources in Punta San Juan, a number of other zoos within North America and in Europe, and a number of other foundations. So thank you very much. I guess some questions, time for questions, okay? I don't know, John, can you bring up the lights? Does anybody have questions? Yes. Yeah, did everybody hear that question? No? Okay, so the question was, Mandy is a keeper here at the zoo, and she's been to Punta San Juan, and she was asking, so are there any sort of comparable institutions or partners in Chile that can tell us about the trends in Chile, or even if some of the animals that we've tagged in Chile, they've identified, or sorry, that we've tagged in Peru, they've identified in Chile. There is actually the Milwaukee County Zoo is doing some very similar things with at least one Chilean population. So we do have them. What I'm not sure about, so they're actually doing censusing as well. So we're doing the Peruvian census. Milwaukee is kind of spearheading the Chilean census. What I'm not sure about, and I don't think this is the case, I'm not sure that they're actually, at least in recent years, catching up any birds where they might actually see bands, So I don't think they're doing that right now. I mean, it's certainly a possibility that if they're doing programs, we're doing an active health assessment right now, and have been for years, which is why we're catching birds. And we do catch some birds that we've caught before. But I don't know, I don't think they're doing any sort of active program at the moment where they're actually catching animals, where they could do that. But they certainly are doing census work and things like that. They're counting the birds at least. Well, disbursement, and Mandy was asking if Alonzo, our graduate student, if he was sort of looking at that, but he's actually looking at a much smaller picture because he has to be done with his master's in 2 years, so he's not trying to conquer all that. But certainly dispersal is really important, and looking at genetic drift and where animals are going. Now, the one thing we can do with our population, with all the blood samples we have a bunch of blood samples. We have some money to do some of the evaluation of those studies. The rest of that blood is just being frozen. And when we have the money, we'll do as many kind of studies on the blood as we can. We can look at the genetics of some of this blood in the future. It's going to be stored forever. We have some of this blood, and so we can look at genetic drift and things like that within just our population to see how much sort of new genetics is coming into the population and how much is potentially leaving. But that's not something we can actually afford to do with the samples we have right now, but it's possible.
You mentioned West Nile and Peruvian area. Huge densities of birds at a certain time. Do you have data on how important is the exception for those?
We actually don't, so that's a good question. So the question is with regards to some of the things like West Nile and malaria, do we have any indication of how important pathogens like that or any others might be to these populations? We don't. They haven't been looking at that long enough to know, like, for example, in 1955, was there some disease that came through the population? You know, we've really only been looking at this with any level of intensity with regards to the health of the birds for about the last 6 or 7 years. Nobody else has been doing it. I can say that I can't recall too many instances of disease within other kinds of penguin populations. So when you look at African penguins or Galapagos penguins, I can't recall any citations that refer to disease in those populations. With that said, I can't imagine why there wouldn't be, but there aren't any documented cases at least. But I can't see why they wouldn't. That wouldn't be an issue. Yeah.
When the birds are not nesting and not nesting and reproducing and not molting, are these lands sensitive to the birds, or are there some?
So the question is, when they're not nesting or molting, are these areas just free of penguins? Right after the molt, they can be free of penguins because everybody is starving. They've been sitting on the beach just molting. They can't fish when they're molting. So then they usually all head out to the ocean for a number of weeks to kind of fatten up, and they'll come back. But this location always has some penguins around year-round. It's going to fluctuate, you know, depending on who's molting, if they can squeeze in 2 breeding periods in a year or just 1 breeding period. But Humboldt penguins and most of their spheniscid cousins, that's sort of the family of penguins that they belong in, they are always kind of loosely associated with land. So they're not some of these true subantarctic species that go out into the ocean for 7 months and don't come back. They're always sort of loosely associated with the land, yeah. Yep. Anything else? Any other questions? Great, all right, well, thank you. Thanks for coming.